This announcement at the beginning of the video before the Cutrone zone goes out to Greg. And the message is that Trump is a capitalist. And we should oppose him as best we can. The deportations that are going on right now have to be opposed. They're not justifiable, even if they are legal. And so one of the tasks of Sublation, as we align with the campaign, is to build up the forces, to build up the ability to actually be useful and helpful to working people wherever they're from. And so we just have to be patient and take our time and say no to offers from the Democrats to be diverted. So anyway, that goes out to Greg. And here is the Cutrone Zone.
That when I think of Israel-Palestine, I think of Long Island. And I think, would people do suicide bombing over like a property line dispute in the backyard? Yes, they would. Like, you know what I mean? Like, they absolutely would. You know, like when, you know, like if you love your mother, you strap on this, you know, explosive vest and go kill our neighbors because, you know, they're mowing their lawn on the wrong side of the property line. You know?
All right, well, welcome to the Cutrone Zone again. I'm Douglas Lane. I'm going to give my bio. The author of Bash Bash Revolution, Wave of Mutilation, Last Week's Apocalypse, and head of Sublation Media. And of course, the star of the show is with me today, the last Marxist, Chris Cutrone, resident genius, track coach, contrarian, et cetera, et cetera. Chris, welcome again. So before we started recording, Chris, you were telling me that you've been wrestling with the issue of Trump's tariffs. You've been commissioned to write a piece for Compact, which I think you're still writing.
Yep.
And we're going to discuss how socialists should understand the question of Trump's tariffs and the supposed collapse of the U.S. economy within 90 days. I saw that on Twitter this morning, someone saying, because the stock market's down again today, I think, that
Right.
that Trump has collapsed the U.S. economy since taking office.
Mm-hmm.
So how should socialists think about all of this, the tariffs particularly? What's your way in on that?
All right. So last time we talked about the crisis of neoliberalism and the emergence of post-neoliberalism.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that the situation is the world economy never quite fully recovered from the Great Recession,
Mm-hmm.
and also has not recovered from COVID. So there are deep structural problems with international trade. You know, the global economy has been problematic, and it's been lurching along. And I think that, you know, one of the things that I've been thinking about is how the criticism of Trump is that this is someone who just bankrupts companies, and now he's doing it with the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, well, he's doing it to the world economy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Meaning, why does one declare bankruptcy? To save a business and to renegotiate terms with creditors.
Mm-hmm.
And he's doing a preemptive declaring bankruptcy of the world economic system. Because it needs restructuring. And this is how you restructure. You restructure through a bankruptcy process.
Well, I mean, literally, we can't just declare bankruptcy in the United States the way a company can. So what would it mean to declare the world's economy bankrupt?
Well, okay, so there has been some popular discourse around this, so I'll just tick off the way that people have talked about it. So the end of the Bretton Woods system by Nixon, and the Plaza Accords by Reagan. as a restructuring in which other economies agreed to accept the burden of what was essentially a US default. Because the US is too big to fail. And so it's, it's why Trump always got bailed out by his creditors, because he was worth more to them staying in business than liquidating. And obviously the United States is that. In other words, the United States is not going to go bankrupt. It's not going to be liquidated. It can't be liquidated. I mean, if they tried to liquidate the United States, then what you have is 300 million Nazis waiting to be unleashed on the world with 5,000 nuclear warheads and 10 or 20 aircraft carriers or whatever. I mean, in other words, if the whole world turned against the United States, what are they going to get? I mean, so they're not going to do that.
Well, you can see that in a way because of how the weakening of the PRI created the cartel and gang problem.
No, I mean, people think Trump's a fascist. What kind of fascism would arise in the United States if the world turned against the United States? And that's why I've had to, get out ahead of this with my Greenland article and say, look, any opponents of the United States are slave states. There's no negotiating at that point. It's unconditional surrender. So that's just not going to happen. Anyway, that's not going to happen. And so the real question is how to restructure the world economy. And that is economic and geopolitical. I mean, so I don't like the multipolarity thing. I don't like geopolitics, which is an inherently right-wing ideology, I think, that whole notion. And, it is inseparable ultimately from Alexander Dugin or whatever, and it's, jihad versus McWorld, it's realism, it's Mearsheimer, it's Samuel Huntington, Clash of Civilizations. This is all right-wing stuff. This is all like profoundly reactionary stuff. So I don't like giving into any of that. However, clearly Trump wants these things tied together, meaning renegotiating trade with Europe, renegotiating trade with Japan and South Korea. I mean, he's literally put on the table the cost of U.S. military protection for South Korea. He's like, oh, that's a factor in our trade negotiation, the cost of the U.S. military in South Korea. And it's like what he did with Zelensky in Ukraine, where he's just like, okay, sign over all your rare earth minerals, and then we might help you. Right? I mean, he's driving a very hard bargain, and he's literally, it's a balance sheet of, including like military. Like what value do you get from the U.S. as your military? And it's Stephen Moran. It's his white paper from last year. I mean, it is according to this plan. There is a plan. And, the idea is that the U.S. provides two public goods to the world: military protection and currency. And that everybody depends on that, including military enemies, to still depend on both those things, actually, right? So Iran benefits from U.S. military predominance because, of course, I wrote about this in my Afghanistan essay when Biden pulled out of Afghanistan, which is that, even the so-called enemies of the U.S. still depend on the U.S. for the global military situation because they have more important military rivals in the U.S. Ultimately, Russia and China are much more military enemies than either of them are to the U.S. And there's India too. There's India and Pakistan. These are all nuclear-armed countries, and that's ultimately why Iran wants nukes. Iran wants nukes not because of Israel, because of Russia and Pakistan and India and China. That's why. And then there's Europe. And there's the whole question, I think, that they were talking about, like, what fighter they're going to be, what jet fighter. And there's a question of whether the F-35s can carry French nukes. And if they can't, then they have to go with another fighter. This is the way they're thinking, you know? And of course, the United States doesn't want any of these countries to have nuclear weapons. They don't want the British and the French to have nuclear weapons. They don't want Pakistan and India to have nuclear weapons. They don't want Russia and China to have nuclear weapons. They don't want Israel to have nuclear weapons. They really don't. Right? So, you know, they are restructuring the whole thing. And in a way that's inevitable. And so the question is, how is it going to happen? Meaning, you could try to sort of jury rig it and keep it going, like the bipartisan consensus would have it. But it's not working. It's falling apart. It's not happening. And in fact,
well, look, I want to raise something with you here, actually, because as you're describing this to me, I'm reminded of debates we had 5 years ago, or around 2020. And I don't remember if I think I was already out of the MHI at that point, but I was still arguing with you a little bit about, and maybe it wasn't then, maybe it was later on, but the, and it also was, so I'll just articulate this all the way through. At the time I was saying, listen, the economic crisis that came out of the 2008 recession has not gone away. And ultimately, there will have to be a reckoning, and that will mean, I would say at the time, a depression, some sort of massive devaluation. Otherwise, we can't have a boom. That's just a very simple-minded way of thinking that I, held on to from reading Marx. But could have read others, but it's coming out of Marx. And you were saying at the time, no, if Trump gets elected, there could be a massive recovery. We could be looking at a boom, And then Trump later on is saying, we're going to enter a golden age. And he was promising recovery.
But he says also some pain now.
No, of course, that's right. But, and then you would say, well, we can't really tell. It's opaque. We can't really tell. And I was like, no. Look, Michael Roberts.
I know. These are the people that people turn to, right? Michael Roberts. Right. And it's like, this is just Stalinism.
Well, you say it's Stalinism, but what you're saying now kind of fits with what they were saying. They were saying,
no, I'm not saying something different. In other words, the U.S. has recovered and the world has recovered from the 2008 downturn. They did. Okay. And then COVID set them back again. But the question is the strength of the recovery. There was a boom in the first Trump term. There was, and Obama claimed credit for it. Obama said, yes, there's a boom, but basically we set it up for Trump and he's just benefiting from it. However, and then COVID, there was a COVID shock. And, as Marxists, we would say it's not the oil shock of the 70s that causes the great downturn, but that just exposes the structural problems that were already there. And that's what we're talking about. In the same way that the housing bubble didn't cause the Great Recession, it exposed the underlying problem.
But it was also a consequence of the financialization.
The way growth had been succeeded previously. Yeah. That's right. So here's the thing. Rather than thinking about it, I mean, the reason that it's opaque and the reason that it's difficult to conceive of is that it's actually abstract. It's not concrete. In other words, people who say, too many minorities were given mortgages that they couldn't pay for, and that triggered the housing bubble.
That's not true.
But at a certain level, of course, it is true.
Well,
of course, it absolutely is true. In other words, if you expand the pool of people who have mortgages to people who can't afford to pay for them,
here's my inner Democrat. You want to hear my inner Democrat?
That's the thing, right?
Okay, but here's yes, okay, that's true. That was a contributing factor, but to focus on that small sliver of irresponsible lending for mortgages, which was going on,
and rapacious lending. In other words, they were taking advantage of people.
That's true, but not only Black people. It was going on in all sorts of across. I knew people who were getting a second.
But to concentrate on that small sliver, as a Marxist, we'd have to say, well, to talk about the housing bubble is also a small sliver.
Which I did at the time. I would say, no, it comes down to the declining rate of profit, blah, 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 blah. Right.
What I'm saying is it's not any of those things. It's just not any of those things. In the same way that the Yom Kippur War didn't cause the deindustrialization of America because of the oil shock. Like, just give me a fucking break. You know, because people said that. They said, oh, yeah, the last time the West stood by Israel, look at what happened. Right? You might as well say Allah is punishing us, you know?
Yeah.
So no, because it's kind of like that. No, so here's the thing. So the way that I would describe it is not, okay, you need destruction of value, and therefore we're looking for like concrete things to be destroyed. No, we're talking about an accumulation crisis.
Right.
In other words, value has to be destroyed, but in such a way that actually allows for an accumulation to come out of it.
Right.
And so, I mean, I've used this phrase before because people do say this. Like the 2008 recession and then COVID, the recovery from each of those and those occasions were the largest transfers of wealth upwards ever. Right. First Great Reset, and then COVID was the biggest ever.
Right.
And you know, so what does that mean? Well, it means that's the necessity. The necessity is the capital accumulation.
Right.
Right. So that's what's necessary. It's not like, oh, the profiteers just suck the blood out of the working class. No, the problem is that capital loses value, which means you need more of it, which means you have to accumulate more of it. And how does that happen? It happens through concentration. And how does that happen? Well, of course, that happens through loss of purchasing power for everybody else.
Right.
Right. So you don't need a war. You don't need like concrete.
No, I know you don't need an actual war, but you did. So what we're talking about now is an intentional devaluation of U.S. assets, and then along with it, the rest of the world's assets as well.
Well, so that's the thing. So Trump has definitely been talking about this since 2015, inflate away the debt. In other words, devalue the dollar. And that's what the end of the Bretton Woods moment with Nixon was about. That's what the Plaza Accords were about. And so the question is whether you can get them to agree to this, you know, get Japan, China, South Korea, Europe all to agree. Or to agree severally. Maybe not all agree together, but agree, each of them agree. You know, to bail out the United States because they need it. You know, and, you know, I've always said this, China doesn't want to be the economic or the military hegemon.
Right.
It doesn't want to be either of those things. It can't.
And that's because of the character of its state.
Yes.
Primarily. It's
and its geopolitical situation. Yeah, and its geopolitical situation. Meaning that you know, China wants the ability to grow on its own terms. It doesn't want the price for that to be to rule the world. Now, it's not that the US wants that either, but also the US has been that, feels that it can do that.
Right.
Right. And so, I mean, the US still is larger economy than China with a smaller population, which means per capita production and consumption much higher than China, both production and consumption. And, you know, it just is the global power, and that's just not going to change. Like, nobody wants that to change. China,
and I want to throw in a thought here.
Europe doesn't want to be the global hegemon. Give me a break. Of course they don't.
In order to be, don't you need to be revolutionary in order to be the global hegemon?
Of course. Yes. Why was Britain the global hegemon? Because it was revolutionary. Of course. Like, in other words, this is the thing. It's not accidental that the US is what it is.
Right.
That's not an accident. It's not like, oh yeah, they had this revolution, and you know, in the meantime, like, I don't know, forces of production, or I don't know what people think, right? Or the you know, the profits of slavery, you know, just some like monstrous accident and total injustice put the US in its position. It's like, no. You know, this is why it's very hard for people to abandon their pejoratives. Capitalism, imperialism. Obviously I've staked my whole reputation as a leftist on the idea of imperialism, just no. Meaning, if you're just going to use it that way, if you're not going to look at it analytically, and you're not going to think of it as a political opportunity for socialism, just don't even say imperialism, because then you're just in this liberal petty bourgeois small r republicanism, hatred of empire, suspicion of imperialism, against concentrated power. And that's fine. Everybody agrees with that. Everybody agrees with that. Imperialism is a bad word, and so just forget about it. In other words, it's not like, oh, Marxism will give you a complete elaborated theory of why it's such a bad word. No, that's not the point of Marxism. And that's also not the point of Marxism with respect to capitalism. It's not like Marxism is here to tell you how very bad capitalism is. No. There are many other people who can do that more convincingly. Pope Francis could tell you how bad capitalism is more convincingly than Karl Marx.
Right. Well, because he's actually against it.
And
Marx was not.
Right. Exactly. In other words, the Catholic Church is very much against capitalism. They're waiting for the return of the Middle Ages. They're hanging on there,
Right.
And Hamas said
they could tell us how bad capitalism is.
And they said, that they're sad at the loss of Pope Francis.
Oh, did they say that?
Of course they're sad at the loss of Pope Francis. Of course.
Well, but you know why? It's because the Hamas people are so pro-trans and pro-gay.
They liked his social justice and his critique of Israel and his, sympathy for the Palestinians, of course. But it all goes together. They're all enemies of capitalism. J.D. Vance too. I'm sure he's an enemy of capitalism at the end of the day.
No, I know. Well, he comes from the left.
Yeah, he's like an Appalachian and whatever, and then he became a venture capitalist, and then he realized...
Those are my people. You can't go after the Appalachians,
What I'm saying is, he's an Appalachian who made good, became a venture capitalist, and is like, yeah, I found out how fucked up the capitalists are.
Right.
That's literally... and then converted to Catholicism, because the Catholics are anti-capitalist in a way that the Protestants aren't. He converted to Catholicism. What is wrong with this guy?
Right.
It's out of anti-capitalism.
It's the cool thing to do these days. Lots of people are doing it.
And they're doing it out of anti-capitalism.
Right. That's
right. They really are,
Mm-hmm.
And so it's Bronze Age pervert, except, you don't have to go back to the Bronze Age to be a pervert. You can just go back to the Middle Ages.
Okay, but here's what I want to say about being revolutionary and being the global hegemon.
Yeah.
In our time, the Cold War, when we were coming up, there were two revolutionary powers. Only if you were in the United States and on the left, you didn't conceive of the U.S. as one of them as really revolutionary. No,
they still did. I always like to say that my whole American Revolution thing was very leftist until yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
Chomsky.
Right. Yeah.
Is pro-American Revolution.
Of course. No, that's true. But in the battle between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Oh, the idea was that the U.S. had betrayed its revolution just as much as the USSR could be said to have, and maybe more than the USSR could be said to have.
Right. Yeah, and because it had never reached for socialism, it didn't have a socialist tradition. Right. Forget about the Socialist Party of America. The United States had never had a socialist tradition.
The Cold War is really hard.
Why? Because we were settler colonialists. Is why we didn't have the...
they did that. I guess that was our time, the quincentenary of Columbus or whatever. But, even then, it wasn't like it is now. It wasn't as pessimistic as it is now.
True.
They did say 500 years of racism, sexism, homophobia, and genocide. But it didn't mean quite the same thing. In other words, there was an embitterment about it. Whereas now it's just like, oh yeah, the U.S. is not special. Every country conducts its war in a genocidal way. They're all the same. Israel, Turkey, the United States. I have Jean Valjean in mind. All militaries carry on war the same way. No one's exceptional. And hell, Turkey's a revolutionary country,
right?
Yeah, except not. Come on. And so but again,
but in a way, there have been revolutionary movements around the world.
Zionism was a revolutionary movement.
Yeah. So
Indian
nationalist, revolutionary,
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's a problem. I mean, what I'd say about the Cold War framework and how we still live with this, like how we got tripped up on this, is that I think the Cold War dealt a serious blow to the very notion of historical progress.
Right.
And I think that even when the kids now are like Xi Jinping thought, they're like Stalin, Mao, Deng, Xi. They don't really mean it. No, they don't really mean it. Like there's some desperate character to it. It's not the same. And I mean, look, after Stalin, it wasn't the same.
No. Yeah.
It really wasn't. And so the whole attempt to like turn Mao into the thing. I mean, in our lifetime, we were talking about this before we started today. Nixon.
Right.
It's funny how the Maoists didn't turn against Mao for making the alliance with Nixon. The actual Maoists didn't.
Right.
But it had to have dealt them a blow. It had to have. And so I think the Cold War screwed everybody up. I mean, the 60s, they did try. There was an attempt with the New Left to be revolutionary, to be socialist, to be for freedom, and reject the East and the West. There was something real to that. But it evaporated. And then they became MLs. And I don't know, I guess they got like convinced by the Cultural Revolution that like China was, and they got confused about Vietnam. It's why Adorno will never be forgiven for saying that the Vietnamese were Stalinists. It's like, this is what happened. People got very disoriented by this. And I think the 70s were a very disorienting time, I should say. Because I always like to point to conflicts between the Soviet Union and China in the 70s through these proxy wars in Africa, and elsewhere. Obviously that became part of the Afghanistan story too. China and the US were on one side against the Soviet Union. China, Pakistan, and the United States were against the Soviet Union and India. And so I think people have been very disoriented around this. I mean, this is why I feel very confident about tracing it back to 1919. I do. Because, I kind of feel like, okay, the Soviet Union just becomes something else. Which is not to like, badmouth it. It's just to say that's not it. Just in a very simple way, the struggle for socialism in the United States, it's just not going to reproduce that experience.
Right.
It's not going to experience the Russian Revolution, and it's not going to have to build socialism the way they had to try to do that in the Soviet Union.
Right.
It's just not the same thing anymore, So now, and again, this is where I feel like some flattening of history has happened, where it's like China is like the communist country, but it's also like the would-be capitalist hegemon, and that's equivalent to socialist progress. In other words, like, I think for young people, it's like, well, of course the socialist country is the most advanced capitalist country, because that's what historical progress means.
Mm-hmm.
And then they have to say, well, the U.S., it's finance capital, and it's parasitic. And anyway, look at how racist the United States is, and settler colonialist, and whatever, right? So they got all these other ways of, like, dodging the issue.
It's not as though China doesn't have its own racism, you know?
Yeah, but, you know, they're indigenous, I guess.
I guess.
They're, in other words, they're just dealing with their immediate neighbors, and it's all very ambiguous.
But if you send the poster for the Star Wars movie to China, they shrink the black man on the poster.
Oh, no, I know. There's that kind of racism too. Oh no, there's that kind of racism too, which is pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a backward country culturally.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's very provincial. You know, it's
by
not
design.
Racist. Yeah, by design, meaning that they've maintained that. They've preserved that. Well, they've had to advance very conservatively.
Mm-hmm.
You know, China. And, like, look, again, it's not about bad-mouthing China. I have sympathy. I do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, however, this is just not the future. And, you know, it's what we talked about last week. China's a second industrial revolution power. Meaning, you know, and will it leap ahead? You know, I doubt it. I don't know. I don't think so. You know, not against the U.S. and Europe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so in terms of, like, if we were to adopt the forces of production idea or something, no, right? It's not that. And ultimately, the ability to revolutionize production is tied to the bourgeois social relations in capitalism.
Yeah.
It is.
This is why I'm so disappointed in Trump right now.
Why?
Because I see the way he's deporting people and undermining due process, the attacks on free speech, the way he is saying things like, "Oh, homegrowns are next." All of this is being an attack on bourgeois relations in a way. You know, like that.
Socialists struggled with the Chinese Exclusion Act at the time. American socialists, they struggled with that one, meaning it was not straightforward for them. We can look back now and say, okay, it should have been straightforward. You know, they should not have in any way supported any kind of exclusion of Chinese immigrants,
of course,
in the early 20th century, and yet that was not clear.
What made it unclear, Chris? Why?
Because it was obvious that, you know, cheap labor undid the gains of the working class.
Okay.
You know, just pretty straightforward.
No, I'm not saying that. Look, I'm not saying that deportations themselves are against bourgeois social relations, although they are.
They are.
I'm not.
Yeah,
right?
because
I'm saying
long ago,
beyond.
It was.
But there was there was a way in which that was handled to try to preserve the fundamentals of property rights.
Because that's the case, by the way, about birthright citizenship. It is a Chinese American guy. That's the Supreme Court case that decides that the 14th Amendment applies to people born in the United States, birthright citizenship. That it's not just about the freed slaves.
Right.
That's the case. It's a Chinese guy. And that's the reason.
Right.
So it's the same thing we're dealing with now. I mean, look, obviously the Democrats were right. They needed to bring in tens of millions of immigrants very fast to save the American economy. I mean, they said so. They said the U.S. economy can't do without immigration, and they're banking on the future. Like, they opened the border. They definitely did. And they did it to secure the capitalist future of the United States. Good.
Right.
You know, but to think that doesn't come at a cost, it does. Meaning it riles up the natives, it does. You know, it generates this whole "we will not be replaced" bullshit. And obviously the human trafficking is just like a monstrous atrocity. Like, in other words, all the people who came to the United States, how many people died on the way? How many people were taken advantage of and are still being taken advantage of? I mean, it is bringing slave labor to the United States. It absolutely is. Right? And, you know, the Democrats are like, well, okay, but we need this to have a future. Okay, that's true. And not just a future of like people who might vote Democrat. No, they mean like we need this as a labor force. And, you know, at the time, I also thought, you know, they need these people, like the young men, that can all be put in the army. That's what happened in World War II. In other words, you know, like if the world wants to do World War III instead of doing what Trump wants, then guess what? You got the Tren de Agua ready to join the U.S. Marine Corps. You know? So,
yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, you know, how many World War II movies are about the WAPs? You know, the Italians, you know, who are like, didn't I just leave this place, Europe? And now I'm like being asked to storm Normandy for what? You know, I thought I was going to the U.S. to get a better life, not to be used as cannon fodder.
Well,
right?
Things don't always work out the way you want. But
but the point of the matter is, of course, the Democrats were right, and of course, the Republicans were right. So what's the problem?
Yeah.
The problem is that the Democrats tried to do it without saying that they were doing it.
Right, and the problem for Trump is he's trying to do it by saying that he's doing it.
Right. Exactly. Now, did you know that so Obama is deporter in chief, right?
Right.
But actually Bill Clinton deported twice as many people as Obama. Nearly.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Close to 11 million, and Obama it was like 5 or 6 million. And Trump,
you think they could just make up their minds? Like, don't go like, oh, we're deporting you. No, come back in. We're deporting you. You know, like.
Oh, but it's all of a piece. It is all of a piece. It's labor discipline.
Right.
It's labor discipline.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you're right.
You know, and so I mean, I think socialists have to organize immigrant workers.
Of course. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
I guess that means implanting them in the community. It means like carving out a place at a socio-political level and not just at an economic level in American society. And, I don't think it's going to be done through like test cases that are trying to lawfare the Trump administration and set up another impeachment or some constitutional crisis or whatever. I don't think that's the way. This is not how you organize the immigrants, because actually the Democrats depend on these atrocities in order to be able to do what they want to do politically with this stuff.
Yeah.
There are going to be atrocities. I mean, the point of the matter is you can't have any kind of deportation regime of any kind without doing it unjustly.
Right. I know this, but
yeah.
But there are ways to do it unjustly, and there are ways to do it unjustly.
Oh, yeah, no. Trump's proud to say, he's throwing red meat to the libtards, right? Like talking to Bukele and saying, Najib Bukele, who, by the way, is Palestinian, president of El Salvador. And his father was Muslim, at least. I don't know if he is. He and his brothers, they all have Muslim names. They all have Arabic names. But anyway, so... I think they were Palestinian Christians, but then I think his father converted to Islam after going to El Salvador. That's what coming to America will do to you. But anyway, but Bukele, where Trump's like, could we send some homegrown American criminals?
Right.
We'll pay you.
He says, I don't know how we can do that legally. We have to work on the legality.
Yeah, he said, Pam Bondi, you can check into the legality. But meaning like find a way to do it.
Right.
And it's just like,
no, look, I can tell them how to do it. It's easy. The label Americans enemy combatants.
Terrorists, yeah. Boom. Terrorists. No,
Done.
Children don't do terrorism. This is what I'm saying. Yeah. This is what I've always said. Children don't do terrorism because they will send you to Gitmo. They will send you to El Salvador. They will. And good luck getting any legal relief.
Right. No, right. I mean, and or they'll just drone strike you. I mean, they can do that too, apparently. But yeah,
all these sensational cases, and what we have to be paying attention to is the grubby reality of it. It's very, I mean, so again, what is Trump trying to do? It's the big stakes. What he's trying to do. I mean, like in other words, the Republicans were there to complain about human trafficking in terms of the grubby reality, the cost of opening the border.
Right.
And now the Democrats are going to say, look at the grubby reality of the deportations.
Right.
Fine. Again, they're both right. They are both right. So we can't be in that conflict.
Right. But to go back to the way we got to this point, we were talking about how it is that the United States has a claim to be revolutionary, and therefore, and has a society that is free in a bourgeois way that's unlike most of the rest of the world, and therefore has some claim when Trump asks the rest of the world to foot the bill for the continuation of.
But of course, they don't have that kind of a claim. In other words, at the end of the day, of course, the Chinese and the Europeans and whomever, I'm sure that they just look very cynically at the United States. I'm sure that they do. So they're just like, oh yeah, the United States thinks that it's this,
but
thing.
It is far less likely for the United States to crack up than it is for even China to, or certainly than Mexico, which is.
Oh, and by the way, part of what they're doing, the Trump administration, they're applying pressure to the fault lines of Europe.
Right.
They are. So, meaning they are trying to separate.
But the EU can crack up without Europe cracking up,
Oh yeah, but it would present problems for some of those countries.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's I would say that what you have here is a calculation, and it is brinksmanship. I mean, like the guy Connolly, who was in the car with JFK.
Oh my God, you're bringing up that.
He was in the room.
Oh, I'm excited. Oh, we're going to talk
in
about
the room
JFK.
with Nixon and saying to Nixon, we have to break the Bretton Woods system because if we don't fuck the Europeans, they're going to fuck us.
Right.
We know that we have all this on tape, right?
Right.
And so and so it's not like, oh, Europeans be our friends, help us out. It was
I know.
We got to fuck you before you fuck us.
No, it's a matter of we are stronger because our society is stronger and we can withstand more shocks than the rest of the world. We're not going to plunge into chaos and lose.
I don't know if anyone sees it that way except for the Americans. I mean, it could be. I mean, China obviously has a realistic view of the United States. It does. In other words, China doesn't want to see Europe replace the United States. No way. And neither does Europe want to see China replace the United States. No way. Because, I mean, Russia's in there. I would just say that. That's a good reason for both sides. Meaning, when China looks at Russia, it sees Europe. When Europe looks at Russia, it sees China. And so if the Europeans did take their leave of the United States, it would mean reconciling with Russia, and that would be a real problem for China.
Right.
Similarly, if China took its leave of the United States, it would mean confronting Europe with Russia.
Another thing I'm noticing as we talk this way is that an attachment to our state develops in the conversation. Like, oh, the U.S. state or
it's scary.
Chinese. Yeah,
it's a scary. I mean, look, I can legitimately say I'm not sure that it's just good in some unalloyed way that the U.S. remain the global hegemon. but I am saying it's likely. You know, and what are the alternatives? Meaning, I would love to say China or Europe are better alternatives. I would love to be able to say that.
Because then you would think that there was a place that was less brutal than what you experienced in the United States.
Maybe. I mean, I know that China's brutal, and I know that Europe is brutal. In other words, if I look at things from a working class perspective, I can only imagine myself. Like when I think of Europe, the first thing I think about is being a working class person, including being an immigrant in Europe. And I'm like, not sure I'd want to be an immigrant in Europe as opposed to being an immigrant in the United States. I'm just not sure about that. You know?
It would depend on which country you're in.
It does depend on that. It does. But even so, there would be this kind of funny, like, oh, like I'm a permanent outsider.
Oh, yeah.
You know? And it's like, that sucks. I mean,
that's less the case in the United States.
It's less the case in the United States. It absolutely is less the case in the United States. And so, and then of course there are no immigrants in China. I mean, there are some, but right? That's just, forget about that, right? But I think of being like a working class person, like a provincial working class person in China, and what that would look like, or being a working class person in Hong Kong, what that would look like, and it's kind of like, So sure.
What would be better about being a working class person in the United States as compared to Hong Kong?
Well, you're just not facing this mafia state, Communist Party. I mean, you are facing a mafia state. I mean, here in Chicago, you face a mafia state, Democratic Party. In New York, it looks like there's still some wriggle room because I guess Eric Adams is no longer a Democrat or something. I don't know if he's declared to be an independent now, right? Because they're going after him. Just the possibility of some rearrangement of the ruling cartels. Just a little bit, something, right? Or you can move. I mean, in China, you can't just pick up and move.
Right.
I guess in Europe, you can pick up and move, but then good luck.
Well, same in the United States.
Same in the United States, but I kind of feel like the United States, again, it's just a sort of a different proposition. I kind of feel like there would be less red tape, moving within the United States than there would be in either Europe or China.
Right.
And so, I mean, and ultimately capitalism depends on that too. Meaning the more hyper-managed capitalism of Europe and China is a liability, actually.
Right.
And I think that that's the other thing is that young people, they think that like state management of capitalism is socialism. And they think that it makes capitalism more politically tractable. And I kind of feel like it actually makes capitalism in some ways less politically tractable because good luck going against these dominant parties.
Right.
Meaning if you had more state control over capitalism in the United States, it would of course make the political parties that much stronger. And you'd be more dependent on being connected to the parties.
Right.
So, I mean, again, when I say I want a socialist party, I don't want a socialist party like a capitalist party.
Right.
Yeah. Because that's the other thing. I think that people are like, oh, socialist party because the capitalist parties suck. And I'm like, no. We'd need a socialist party even if the capitalist parties were much more functional.
Right. In fact,
we needed more.
Yeah.
We needed even more. Right. I mean, that's the thing that gets me so angry when I think of the 1930s or the 1960s. When I think of previous generations on the left that abdicated on building a socialist party, I just think, and that they sort of convinced themselves that they couldn't build a socialist party because the parties were so big and so powerful and so thoroughly organized. And now I feel like, okay, so now in the era of neoliberalism, my whole life, what's been the excuse?
Right.
Right?
Right.
What's been the excuse? Oh, because Noam Chomsky will tell you it's the coordinator class. It's right. It's not the 1% versus the 99%. You got to worry about 20% against the 80%. And and the PMC and Lenin is just trying to dominate the working class. There have been all sorts of excuses that people have given. I mean, it might have been difficult anyway, but at an ideological level, that certainly didn't help.
Right.
But anyway, coming back to it, what I've been struggling with is I realize that I'm writing something that the compact people don't want to hear.
Right.
Which is that Trump doesn't care about the congressional majority of Republicans in the 2026 midterms. He doesn't care about the voters, like losing support among the voters for the Republicans. He doesn't care about the 2028 election. He doesn't care about any of that. Like, he's going to do this. It's a kamikaze mission. He's 80 years old. I mean, basically. I mean, he says, right, that it's a shame that Biden didn't do a better job, that he had to come back. And I think he really means it. Like, meaning he would love to just be golfing. Like, he's not going to miss a weekend of golfing. Like, he's going to do this. He's going to fight to the last. He'll be a martyr. He'll risk assassination, but he's not going to ever give up a weekend of golfing.
Right. Right. Oh, right? I get it. I get it. Yeah.
But we do have to think about that, because I think that people are like, oh, how can you do this? Oh, like he's like his popularity is plummeting, and the stock market, and right?
I mean, look, right.
The tech giants are now regretting having supported him, and I'm like, he doesn't care.
Right.
And not because he's a narcissistic lunatic, but because he really thinks this is what has to be done. And he's got other people, Scott Bessent and Stephen Moran and Howard Lutnick. He's got a team. They have a reasoned take on this, which is this has to happen.
I mean, look, here's one thing I do think about when I watch Trump around the tariffs. I mean, like I said earlier, I'm disappointed, and I didn't vote for Trump. I knew intellectually that Trump wasn't going to be able to create socialism, and that ultimately, right? And ultimately, more than that he wasn't even going to really be able to roll back the long attack on civil liberties in this country, or create conditions that would make it easier to organize. That the very best I could hope for, and this is me thinking like a Democrat, actually, was that we would at least pause the onslaught a little bit, right? Or maybe a little bit of rollback on some, like the censorship apparatus would be dismantled. That would be good, right? The old ways that we were censored through just...
I mean, look, censoring people, I mean, maybe there is a difference. I don't know. Censoring people for, like, debating COVID.
Right.
Versus censoring people for supporting terrorism. I mean, look, I'm all for publish all the Hamas stuff you want. Like, go for it. Like, right. I am a free speech absolutist, totally. But like,
look, no,
like,
no, Chris, no.
Pandemic.
One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist.
But who's the freedom fighter?
I can't say.
Fauci?
That's why I can't censor. That's why I can't censor people for supporting terrorists, because I'm not in a position to know all the time who to be censored and who.
I don't think it's epistemic humility. I think that you could just say, like, they have in Europe, they have like hate crime legislation, and you can't insult people's religion, and you can't do this and you can't do that, and it's all very reasonable. Like, it's all very enlightened. I'm sure the Europeans, I'm sure that they've all figured it out. What's harmful speech, and God bless them. So. I don't think it's a matter of epistemic humility. I think it's a matter of what was the free speech issue of our time? COVID.
Right. And then Ukraine. But no, look, okay, you say it's not a matter of epistemic humility, but Mills would disagree. I mean, and
John Stuart Mills.
Yes.
Sure.
if we want to get to the truth, we cannot presume to know it in advance. We have to hear all sides in order to reason together. We can't abide dogmatic approaches to establishing.
No, I agree. But what I'm saying is it's just a different political point.
Yeah.
Like, and it's all done in the same terms, right? Which is that you censor terrorism because of some statistical calculation about how many lives you're going to save or something. I don't know. Right?
Yeah.
And same thing, why COVID information, misinformation, disinformation had to be restricted because there was some statistical level of death that one was
Which was all bullshit, by the way.
Sure. Well, I mean, the terrorism stuff is equally bullshit, right? But like, I mean, obviously,
right.
Now, but at the same time, I kind of feel like it's the reason that they're different is that you fight them a little bit differently.
Right.
Meaning like material aid to terrorism is like a criminal offense.
And
like you can fight it. It's just different than fighting like Fauci.
No, I agree. But anyway, I had expected that things would ease up, and they haven't seemed to ease up in that.
I mean, it's unclear. It's unclear. Meaning, I don't know in gross terms, is Trump just turning the machinery of the state against his enemies as opposed to the Democrats turning it against their enemies? I do think that probably there's a difference in scale. At some level, but also, there is the principle. I mean, look, I'm not saying that there's no principle. What I'm saying is, as a political matter, I think people voted for Trump. I mean, again, the Democrats will tell you they voted for Trump because of inflation.
Right.
I do think it was a COVID referendum. I do. I think people remembered. I think anyone with children in school remembered. They remembered voting for Biden and then regretting it.
Right.
And that's, so I just think, what did people vote for? Well, they voted for a bunch of different things. And the thing is, Trump ran on a bunch of different things. He promised to deport the Palestine Solidarity protesters. He promised to deport all the people that Biden let in by opening the border. And he did promise tariffs, and he promised like law and order,
right?
And I think that from studying Trump for 10 years now, I have my own sense of what his priorities are. And I would say the tariffs are the priority. I would say everything else was opportunistic, meaning what could he point to tear down the Democrats and win election? I mean, look, he's flip-flopped on the trans issue.
Right.
He used to be like, I don't care, people should just use whatever bathrooms, right? And he probably still thinks that. But it's like a talking point in every speech, like no men and women's sports.
It's not the same as the bathroom.
It's not the same, but at the same time, like he just wasn't talking about that.
Right.
In 2016 or in 2020.
Well, all that stuff is just nonsense stuff. I think it's
nonsense stuff, except people are willing to kill over it, Doug. I mean, really, at the end of the day, people are willing to kill over it.
Making sure that get the trans women out of women's sports, they'll kill over it, and also the other way around, they'll kill over it. You think?
Sure.
Okay, but all right, but
right, and that's going on. That is going on.
Yeah, but why is that going? But anyway, but what I would say, to go back to the tariffs, is that I've noticed that suddenly leftists are very concerned about short-term stock market fluctuations. And
I think Bhaskar came out in favor of the tariffs.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, because
Oh,
Sean
okay.
Fain did.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
Bronco, who spoke at the convention, came out against the tariffs. So evidently there's room for disagreement on this.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Bhaskar is against these tariffs, but he thinks generally it's a good idea.
Right. But just not the way Trump's doing.
Yeah, not Trump, right? And so, and these things are going to be adjudicated. I think Congress is going to try to assert control over the tariffs at some point, or for them to be fully implemented, it will have to be ratified by Congress, meaning all these trade deals will ultimately have to be passed by Congress in the same way that the USMCA had to be passed by Congress.
Mm-hmm.
So it will all come down to that, and it will require some bipartisan consensus. Especially if some Republicans oppose it out of principle. Some Democrats are going to support it out of principle.
Right.
Right? That's going to happen.
And just to go back to the kind of the earlier part of the conversation, if Trump is not able to cut good deals, and if China and Europe say stand up against Trump in the United States here, the consequence could be a massive decline in U.S. standing in the world, and there would be potentially a need for a new hegemon.
There are so many things going on here. So an interesting statistic that I found was that actually the U.S. is one of the least dependent countries on international trade in the entire world. China is much more dependent. Germany is much more dependent on trade. Of course, England and France. Pretty much any country is more dependent on trade than the United States.
Is that because of agricultural need or
domestic production, everything? Yeah. Just generally speaking, the U.S. can go it alone in a way that the other countries can't.
No one really can, but yeah, much
more so the U.S. can. Yeah. And especially if they have Mexico and Canada on their side, then that's the whole ball game then. And the point of the matter is that neither China nor Europe is going to be able to pry Mexico or Canada away from the U.S. because they trade much more with the U.S. than they do with China and Europe.
Right. Because of physical reality.
Yeah. All sorts of things, right? So it's just, they don't have the cards, right? The U.S. has the cards. They don't have the cards. Now, are they going to be happy about it? Again, maybe not. Are they going to resist it? I think that Japan, they were going to do a deal, but then they can't because there's a election coming up in Japan. And so it's like, the ruling party doesn't want to risk, or maybe even within the ruling party, they don't want to, the politicians don't want to risk against rivals taking advantage of being able to say it's a bad deal or whatever. And so, there are many different factors involved. However, it's a long-term thing. And I think that ultimately what the U.S. is going to do, especially with these people like Stephen Moran and Scott Bessent, they're going to sit down with all these countries and they're going to tell them all the same thing, which is that long-term, this has to happen. Meaning, look at, we can't just keep patching things up and just keeping it going. Right. That it's the Ray Dalio thing, right? The unsustainable, all these different regimes are unsustainable. And it's the unsustainability of these different regimes, the trade regime, the credit regime, the geopolitical regime, the internal political regime in the United States. Like some realignment of the parties to some extent has to happen. And, so all these things coming together at once means a change has to happen. Now, how it happens makes a big difference. And I think the U.S. can plausibly make the claim that it offers the least chaotic and painful path of that change. Meaning, like, this change is going to happen with or without World War III. So can we do it without World War III?
Right.
And I think that's an easy case to make.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we don't have Nazi Germany. and we
No.
don't have Imperial Japan, and fascist Italy. Like, we just don't have these people. They're not Putin is not.
Right.
He's not. And so, I mean, not to say that Putin is not bad, he is, but he's not that.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
so, it's just a different gamble. I think it's just a different gamble. Like, not the Nazis took a gamble. I mean, Germany took a gamble on the Nazis. The Nazis took a gamble,
Mm-hmm.
and Imperial Japan took its gamble, and it was a big gamble, and they paid dearly for it.
Mm-hmm.
They were nuked. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anybody's doing this, because that's what it would take. Right. And the U.S. is obviously not, like, the idea that the U.S. is abandoning soft power in favor of hard power. No. What would hard power even mean?
Right.
No. All soft power.
No, it's clear. I mean, that's clear enough.
Right.
The United States is not abandoning soft power. They are reconfiguring the soft power, and they're going after the political enemies within the federal bureaucracy. But they're not abandoning soft power. The deal making is soft power.
Tariffs are soft power. Absolutely.
Right.
It's also, I mean, what I want to say is, just reflecting on the nature of our discussion so far, I think the problem is thinking all these things together without mixing them up, right?
Mm-hmm.
So thinking of them in parallel without mixing them up, meaning, like, I mean, we are subjected to a constant barrage of Democrat propaganda. So the first thing that we need to understand is that's all nonsense. Meaning, they were literally saying a few weeks ago, Doug, that firing government workers was triggering a recession.
Right.
And so this is the way things get jumbled up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, no, and then it turns out, it's such a small percentage of the federal workforce anyway, right. And it might cause a brief recession in DC, right? But no, what are we even talking about? And so I think that what you were saying about, like, obviously the connection between the U.S. having its roots in the American Revolution and the Civil War, and being the capitalist hegemon militarily and economically, obviously the connection there is very mediated, we could say. Right. And so it's not like the U.S. is going to say we're the freest country and that's why we should continue to rule the world. Like, it's just not about that. Right. Now, Trump gave a speech recently, and I was a little bit flabbergasted about the 3 words that he would use to define the United States. And I don't remember what they all were, but freedom was not one of them. Yeah. Freedom was not one of them. What love and work, like love and work and maybe something else. I don't know. It's like family, something. And I was like, freedom's not one of them. Yeah. And that should be easy. 3 words to define the U.S. Freedom can't be one of the top 3, right? But it isn't, and maybe it's because the Democrats already patented it in the Harris campaign. Join freedom. And in other words, maybe if so the Democrats
also it's because of the tariffs,
right?
It can't be freedom.
You think?
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah.
But so our look, me saying freedom. It's about leftist intellectuals. And do we have our heads so far up our ass with Heidegger and Althusser and science and blah that we give up on freedom? Right. So it's not about, like, me saying freedom has nothing to do with the way capitalist politicians say freedom.
Right. Yeah. It's much more open-ended.
Yeah.
Freedom.
And so, and it's much more substantial, meaning, of course, like, I believe in historical freedom in a way that the capitalist politicians might not. They don't need to. It might be like a liability for them.
Yeah, but I do think that we discussed in this episode so far the way in which American freedom is actually a strength even for the capitalist class. I mean, you've mentioned it in various ways. Even if that freedom is highly mediated and turns into unfreedom in a variety of ways.
I mean, what they would say is that the U.S., if you were to, I don't know, if somehow we could beam in Larry Summers right now and say, Larry Summers, the United States, capitalism, freedom, what would he say? He would say, well, of course, the U.S. maintains a technical edge over China because we're free and they're not.
Of course.
In other words, it would just be turned into like, there's more like scientific freedom, there's more technological research freedom or some shit, right?
Right, no, right. And that's not wrong.
It's not wrong, but it's also like not exactly what we're talking about.
It's not what socialists are talking about.
Right.
But it's also not what we're,
it's related, but it gets a little bit ass backwards, it gets a little bit flipped. Where, we should be concerned about the freedom of the working class.
Right. But we should also say in the next breath, a free working class would be more innovative than anything this world has seen.
Oh, well, that's certainly true. No. I'm just saying that, like, I think that the capitalists just think, well, of course the workers are not very free and they don't need to be, but who needs to be free are some scientists. Except it turns out,
I get what you're saying.
It turns out they shouldn't be free because COVID, you don't want misinformation, right? I mean, I love the fact. I mean, look, you want to know the index of freedom in the Trump administration? It's Jay Bhattacharya has
I know.
Francis Collins' position in the administration.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I know.
That's it. That's freedom. That is freedom, actually.
I love him, and he's so boring in a way, but I really love Jay Bhattacharya. Because he's
in there, and Kamala Harris would never have put him in there, ever, in a million years. Never.
Oh, I know,
right? Only Trump can do that.
And all the people are like, oh, we need merit. We need to return to the meritocracy. We need smart people. They don't really talk about Dr. J. They don't really. No one's really talking about him because he just comes out. I saw a clip of him today. He just was explaining the limits of the mRNA vaccine.
Yeah. And
how the regulators might want to reconsider how they go forward with those. And he made it clear. I could follow it. And I was like, oh yeah, that's how this.
No, don't you know he's an anti-vaxxer? He's a COVID disinformation guy, Yeah. I mean, he was banned.
He wasn't banned for his vaccine stance. It was the lockdowns that he opposed. But yes,
Sure. Yeah. It's all of a piece, though, right? And I feel like that's about as good freedom as we can get
right now.
And that's based on the simple competition of parties.
Right. Listen, we should cut it off here and do the second half. But in the second half, I do want to talk to you about Harvard and also the left.
Yes.
And how the left is handling this. And I would. You know what? I would extend the left all the way over to Compact, because I can't these days.
Because there are leftists who write for Compact, yeah.
There are, but also I just feel like the mentality of Compact and the mentality of the broad left are not different, right?
Not really distinguishable.
No.
But that's because the left is the right.
Right. I know. But I mean, like Trump is stupid, and just sort of instinctual dismissal. And if you don't do it, you're considered MAGA. You're like, oh, you're making apologies for Trump, and you've taken the, you're part of the cult, part of the Trump cult. But yeah, just we all have to join the Trump cult. That's what I'm going to say. That's on the end this.
That's what we'll talk about in the second half. All right.
Yeah, that's right. All right.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.